Welcome to the Cyber Call, the podcast by Ride of Boom for managed service providers looking to stay ahead in an ever-changing world of cybersecurity. Each week, we dive into the latest threats, trends, and real-world strategies to help MSPs protect their clients and grow their businesses. Let's build a safer, stronger community together.
All right. Happy Monday and welcome everybody to the Cyber Call. Andrew Morgan here with a star-studded group. As we get folks to file on in with us, hope your tax day just went swimmingly last week. Chip, I know it's something you look forward to every year, correct? I mean, it's, that, birthdays, Christmas, it's right up there.
I just accept it as waking up on a freezing cold morning when it was supposed to be 50 degrees. It's you deal with it. I stay organized about it throughout the year, so there's not like this mad rush at the end. Get everything to the accountant. Now I started running I take all my stuff and I run it through an AI first and actually get like a response back and see how my accountant's work compares to it. This year I actually asked if I was getting good value for what I'm spending, and the AI that I would work with told me, yeah, you actually are. You got a pretty complicated tax return, so you're doing all right.
Wow. That's a really interesting use of AI. Now, when you run all your stuff through it, I'm assuming it's sandboxed and not pointing it out to the world.
No, actually, I could almost care less about that. I mean, tax information. Does anybody think that's not all shared all over the place anyway?
That's right.
So do you think that the world doesn't know your social security number? And
I can't imagine, Chip. No, yeah. There's no, dark web deep goes with my information. Can't imagine. Yeah. Eric, good to see you. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, good to be back.
Yeah, it's good to have you. Chris, Reed. We'll do a formal intro to Reed momentarily, but as always, just quick, I'll mention this now, but I'll mention it at the end. The Mythos Security Ready Mythos program, which was spun up in just days by Cloud Security Alliance, specifically headed up by Rich Mogul there, who's head of research among and got 80 CISOs to collaborate on this document. It's the white paper Chip kind of talked about last week in response to the Anthropic announcement. Both Rich and Sunil, who's one of the big contributors, will be on the Cyber Call next Monday. And John Strand will be chiming in as well. And then I'm going to be running a mad dash to the airport to come see, folks like you, Chip, and Mike out there and others out in Vegas at the Kaseya Connect. So hopefully there's no interruptions between the end of the Cyber Call and making it to the airport. But just keep in mind that that's going to be a really, really interesting one having and in talking to Rich, I'm like, one of my questions, and I'm not going to give away the spoiler, but I'm like, how did you pull that off in basically 48 hours with 80 some odd CISOs and global CISOs and between them, SANS, and OWASP? It was a really amazing feat and produced some really great content that they're going to keep obviously updating. So from a banter perspective, Chip, I just, we were talking about this off camera, but I would just love your take on this. Last week, obviously, we had Stran on, yourself, Kelvin, we spoke about, the Anthropic announcement, which of course it has been beat to death. But I did want to talk about this article that Google put out, because obviously they have some amazing chops these days after getting Wiz and Mandiant. They are certainly one of the foremost security teams out there. And from somebody that's built and as a CTO and developer, one of the things they talked about, Chip, is that in the short term, right, there's this asymmetric, right, tilt towards the threat actors being able to exploit vulnerabilities at machine speed, But over time, this is going to pave way to much better development cycles. They walk through that. I was just wondering, from your perspective, how you view this. They talk about, being able to keep up, right now with it, and that, the scale, sophistication, and things like this is, again, asymmetric. But in the meantime, what did you think about, one, Strand's comment on compensating controls and, doing things very differently, thinking about this very differently, which, by the way, is why we're having Reed on today, because after the, just supply chain after supply chain issue or incidents we had with Light LLM and others and Actis, that's why Reed's here, because I wanted to ask him about the insurance side of things. But when you look at kind of how Strand looked at this and how you look at it as a developer, what are your thoughts?
Well, there's two segments to it. One is sort of the enterprise, non-engineering, non-developer approach, and I think John was referencing that for this audience in such a way of talking about increasing the layers of defense in depth and compensating controls, and the way he was describing it. A picture that evolved in my head was, rather than kind of concentric circles, which is sort of how defense in depth is always represented, it was more like a maze. It had blocks in it and misdirections and dead ends. That's still the idea, the picture in my head that I have for how enterprise, businesses, how corporate networks should be protected. I think there should be a lot more use of honeypots and other things that security researchers use, that are real-time updating firewalls and other elements to lay in. And then when you talk about the software engineering space, yes, this is an absolute explosion. I mean, you're not in the graphs that I look at internally for our engineering stack. March, I think 25th it was. We saw a hockey stick increase in the amount of vulnerabilities that were being exposed, and that about coincided with the beginning of the supply chain attack wars, which we are still in. If you saw Vercel get whacked over the weekend, or maybe it was Friday, but like every article I read over the weekend was more news on the Vercel attack, including how it happened, internal and team member. So it's ongoing. And then, of course, Mythos pops out. I think we all assume that there are Mythos-like models and actors already out there that, didn't make a big announcement about how strong their AI was. I mean, you don't need a general purpose LLM to be incredible. You really need to create an incredible workflow around using a team of agents, even with a much older LLM, and you could probably get the same results. So what does that force the engineering community to do? It forces us to expand even more how we use automated testing, both in the production pipeline, but also on the back end. Once things are in production, we've got to be moving rapidly toward 24/365 pen testing, red teaming of our own, looking for our own 0 days as fast as other people can find them. I would want to be in a place a few months from now where our own teams are identifying our 0 days before they're identified by other people, because we've built really solid tooling on the back end to use, reliably harnessed multi-agent environments to test our own stuff.
Good stuff. Thanks for sharing that. Hey, Eric, I know you represent software companies. Are you seeing any changes in when you sit in conversations, whether it's board meetings, whether it's how they're updating their SLAs with customers? Are there concerns as a manufacturer, what's in their language, and again, SLAs, turnaround times of vulnerabilities, and 0 days and things like that? What's things looking like on the legal front?
Yeah, so all good questions. I mean, the answer is not a simple one. It's multifaceted. It's what are the inputs and what are the outputs, and how is AI affecting both of them? And clients are getting very, very concerned not my clients, but my clients' customers are getting very, very concerned about AI and how it's being used and when it's being used and what's being ingested and what's being put out there. And in fact, I had a conversation with a new client of mine this morning, and he's got a software company that's, largely the output of his SaaS product is AI generated. And, he said, I just don't want to be responsible for it. I said, all right, so you want your customers to pay you for a service, but you don't want to be responsible for it because it's based on AI, right? So it's having those types of conversations that are definitely new. And frankly, I'm seeing it a ton on the MSP side as well. MSP's customers are going hog wild with AI internally, maybe not even telling the MSP what they're doing. And you have all of these call them rogue actors inside of the customer that are using AI for a lot of different things, and the MSP is only finding out about it after the fact. So dealing with a lot of those types of issues as well.
Yeah. I had an interesting conversation with an MSP, a sizable one, Eric. And I'm not sure if you've heard this, Chris, but they deal with a lot of mid-market. And what he was saying, what the research, by the way, is saying, and I brought this up on a call with Chip, the embracement of executives using AI has really hockey sticked. From everything around research to getting work done to collaboration with their peers, etc. And security teams, well-intended security teams in some of their co-managed customers have gone into executive meetings and saying, whoa, we got to put some guardrails around this.
Yeah. So, I'll give you a real world example. A client of mine has a customer that is a multi-billion-dollar family office. And one of the family members just told the MSP, I don't make a single decision without running it through AI first. And, and then so that, it drives the conversation. Well, what are you putting into Claude or GPT, whatever it is that you're using to get the output that's desired? And how confident are you that you're not putting things in that shouldn't be there? And the answer was he never even thought about it. So yeah, huge issues.
It's interesting because I've seen, number one, I think, always, not always, but mostly the fight's been getting executive buy-in to do something from a project. Now you have the executives, the buy-in coming the other direction, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing that's interesting is especially if you're reading a lot of engineers or developers' perspectives, it's actually, in my opinion, creating even more animosity between them and the CEO. So a lot of them didn't trust CEO. Then you see reports of like, well, the CEO is now asking AI whether or not the developer's work is good or not. So there's a lot of tension alongside of what's going on, but there's a lot of tension and cultural shifting that's going on with this too, with this whole, now the CEO, where they really stood outside of IT, now they're deep in IT all of a sudden. And not only they're questioning you, how effective you are doing and all that kind of stuff. So this is really interesting to watch from all perspectives because it's to say it's unprecedented. We've said that 1,000 times, but every week it seems like something new is uncovered that's unprecedented as it relates to AI.
And it's no different than what Chip mentioned at the beginning, right? With running his tax information through AI and asking, is he getting good value from his accountant, right? What happens if AI comes back and says, no, you're not, right? What are you going to do?
Yeah. Well, where I was going to finish where I started in this whole thing was the executives with these well-intended security teams trying to put guardrails on their data and what should go in the LLM. They're getting fired.
Yeah.
If they stand in the way of executives.
Yeah, no doubt.
There's it's just a really fascinating time, and I put fascinating obviously in air quotes, but it is very, very interesting times we live. So let's kind of set the stage for today's cyber call. When Chip and I go back and forth on a multi-day basis on these attacks, when the LLM Light LLM started, into Axios, and looking at these, unprecedented supply chain, we used to think, it's a million or 2 million companies being affected. Well, what was Axios, Chip? Like 450 million? some
I don't know if it's that much, but it's, definitely in the tens of 60 million. It's a number that pops into my head.
I think Axios has said something like 400. It was in the hundreds of millions of downloads. But
downloads.
Yeah, downloads. So I said I went out to Reed. I'm like, Reed, like, is this impacting cyber insurance? Like, what's going on in the world of cyber insurance? If this many companies are seeing, either incidents or potential incidents, like, are the reinsurers starting to get a little freaked here? Like, what's going on? And, the comment was, hey, Andrew, right or wrong, we're in a soft market and we continue to be in a soft market. And I'm paraphrasing Reed, and that's why he's here as our expert, but, somewhat of a reactionary market. Things have to happen for the market to flip to a hard market. And, when you look at, I looked at a bunch of insurance articles, and I forget the name of one of them. I think it was Willis. Does that sound right, Reed? Willis? And
yeah.
And they were saying that their stats are, give or take, and others back this up, 45%, increase in ransomware attacks this year. And yet we still have a soft market. So, Reed, you're here to talk about how in the heck is that still possible? What's going to flip the market? So before we get on into it, thanks for joining. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your company, and I will hand it over to Eric.
Great. Well, real quick, thank you, Andrew, for having me on. My name's Reed. I'm the co-founder and president of Yukon, formerly Fifth Wall. Been around the space for a hot minute here. But primarily our sole dedication at Yukon is cyber and tech E&O. So it's all we do. We work with thousands of agencies across the country. We work with many MSPs across the country, also in collaboration with Eric here on the E&O side. So this is all we do, for good or bad. This is the dedicated practice.
Did you put in whether you felt you were getting value from Eric on the legal side into your chatbot, and if so,
that just broke AI. That's
yeah. There was a lot of conflict. Also, it told me I was the smartest person first. All the
very true.
Yeah,
very true.
Yeah.
Well, Eric, the SOWs and MSAs you get are always well documented and perfect when they go through
100%. Absolutely. Yeah. Exactly.
It never hallucinates.
No, not even once. I do tell my clients though that whenever they give me something that was generated by AI, I do charge them double to review it.
That's good.
All right, Eric, take it away.
All right, perfect. So Reed, we heard Andrew throwing around terms that he probably doesn't even understand, like hard market and soft market and all that good stuff. So let's kind of set the baseline. So when Willis, says in an article that we're in a soft market, what does it actually mean? And particularly, what does it mean on the ground for MSPs and their SMB customers who are looking at and renewing policies right now?
Also, I'll interject here real quick that Willis, out there for the audience out there, they are very large. So
they're huge.
They're huge. So this is not like some kind of small brokerage in the middle of the mountains in West Virginia. So just to give a little credibility where it's due.
Yeah.
Not that there's anything wrong with West Virginia.
Never.
Not at all. No. I think that the thing to define first for the soft market is a cyber soft market is a little atypical, right? Because it's brand new. So typically in insurance, you have a hard and soft market based off of capacity and premiums. And that also kind of goes into demand. Like what we have right now with cyber is what we had in a soft market before 2020. There was low demand, but there really wasn't any reason not to try to essentially buy business. Let's keep premiums down. Let's reduce barriers to entry. Let's get it in as fast as humanly possible. I think we all know the story as we've all lived it between 2019 and 2022, the reaction for the cyber market was extreme losses, right? So that initial, folks called it the hardening market. I would have called it, a correction, given what we were doing was inappropriate, right? So we corrected up. But what ended up happening was not expected, which was we had that spike, and it was almost like lessons weren't learned originally. And we see we still have very high capacity. So we saw folks wanting to double down, put more in the market to generate more demand. And then premiums continue to start to go down. Now it's situational. We'll get into that later. But that soft market's really speaking to the fact that it's a buyer's market right now for cyber.
Yeah, that's great. And so, since that inflection point in 2022, arguably the market's been softening ever since. And how do you reconcile that with the fact that ransomware attack frequency is up something like 45% in that same time period? The whole supply demand thing seems a bit out of whack, maybe, or maybe it's not.
There's multiple things going into the pot, right? All these different ingredients. I mean, one is you still have money coming in at the top, the very top. So the reinsurance level is still in a heavy supply. So in a world where, we experienced a very reactionary state where we saw premiums quadruple at the very least in some industries, and then high scrutinization on underwriting. That pressure is not as high. You can see an uptick in claims, but if you have enough capacity to keep moving, the biggest component right now is you have different insurance companies out there right now. I won't name names, but that, you can still have claims going up, but if you're writing enough business during the soft market, you're playing a volume play, you can continue to move in a way that's working. And I put that in air quotes, working, right? In its perspective, losses could have been in that moment, Eric, above 80% in 2022. Well, now let's say they're closer to 30 or 25%. That's actually not good, but in comparison, it's great.
Got it. So everyone's got a different theory about how this might end, and we might go to the other end of the spectrum into a hard market. So look into your crystal ball, if you would, and tell us, what's your top candidate for that trigger point? Is it going to be a single catastrophic event, or will it be some other type of trend over time?
So we haven't had, catastrophic loss in insurance. When you talk about a hurricane, that's catastrophic loss, right? That has an impact across, believe it or not, pretty much every line in commercial insurance. You're going to see a ripple, right, from the catastrophic loss. I believe there was this assumption that there is, and there still is, a catastrophic loss that's going to occur, that's going to have that ripple effect. So I think when folks, you kind of need to define what does that spark look like, and I think there still is a level of catastrophic loss that was assumed, but we have yet to see, right? But we see pockets of it, right? Like what Andrew and I were talking about the other week, and we're seeing supply chain finally, we knew it's going to rear its ugly head, but it's coming up more and more, and the aggregation of risk. So I just to answer it more succinctly, I still believe there's going to be a heavier catastrophic loss, but now with AI, I think it's going to incorporate a different kind of loss. I also think that, this soft market, given there's a couple players that are kind of creating a false soft market, once they get bitten enough, right, I think we're going to see enough of a reaction. It's kind of a force multiplier right now of keeping premiums down.
Yeah, I think the CrowdStrike, even though it was an attack, but the CrowdStrike issue that we saw a while back and how that impacted, and then it impacted Azure as well. And so I think that was like a dress rehearsal. I think both those organizations moved quickly, and I think the people that were impacted, the impact was incredibly short-lived. But I think that was somewhat of a dry run for what we will see from a catastrophic event, where it won't just be one entity attacked and that'll be the impact. It'll be a ripple effect, supply chain-ish that will do that. So I completely agree with Reed. We're just waiting on it to happen.
Reed, question. Some of the articles made reference that certain industries like healthcare and aviation are seeing anomalistic behavior. Healthcare, for example, we've seen, large payouts because obviously lives are on the line. Is that a part of the reason we see threat actors continue to focus on it, because they know there's a lot of money there and lives are on the line? And is that, the example, whether it's a Change Healthcare or something, one of the types of things that, those are the industries, those are the kind of anomalistic things that are getting the premium increases already?
I mean, I don't know if I could speak to intention there, because I do. You will see trends where they know, right? It's the squeaky wheels getting the grease, right? They know they can continue those efforts and see similar returns. I think on my side of the fence, what I'm more so concerned with, just kind of double back on what Chris validated, is like, it's industry specific. We can see specific industries that are spiking, right? I'll also see, though, there is adaptation to that. We will see a difference in terms of underwriting, right? If it's industry specific. The bigger concern right now is the systemic risk, the aggregation of risk, right? Healthcare systems do represent that. They represent the aggregation of systemic loss, right? To be able to go from one to another. I think that's where, this industry is still feeling very nervous, right? And I don't necessarily think that has to rely on specific industries, but if you look in the way that they interact in these different types of business motions, MSPs are a prime example. That's still where we're kind of sitting and waiting and going, this is inevitable, right? In terms of some type of catastrophic loss.
So Reed, kind of playing on what Chris was mentioning about Cloudflare, Qualys called out a systemic cyber event as the big wild card that might eventually flip the market, right? Whether it's a huge cloud outage, a supply chain compromise, some ridiculously large ransomware attack. So if you look at what happened with Cloudflare, depending on who you ask, it was a loss of somewhere between $5 and $15 billion. Which even in the insurance markets, that's got to be a big loss. So why do you think that didn't flip, or at least start to flip the market?
Well, it's a hell of a delta, 10 billion. But
what's 10 billion amongst friends?
What's 10 billion, right? I think the biggest thing to consider here is that there is the difference between those dollars in terms of how they're equating loss to actual claims and claims dollars, right? So it's got to hit the books for it to actually have an impact. How much of this actually hit the books? I don't have that data in front of me, but I can give you a pretty confident answer that there is still, not all cyber is created equally. There is still so many businesses that don't have coverage, and there's still a lot of businesses that have it, but they have poor coverage. And I think that plays a lot into this. Whenever you have businesses that they're just not hitting the stats because they don't have the coverage, it's not becoming claims dollars. So whenever this starts becoming, the stats start actually pulling out more claims dollars specific of that, between 5 and 10 billion, how much of that actually ended up in claims? Because I think that's going to be the difference maker, right, Eric? It's like you look at that and it's, could have been anywhere, could have been $1 billion, could have been lower in terms of actual.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So, Chip, I'll turn it over to you.
So, Reed, so far we've talked about, things that are still pretty pedestrian compared to where AI kicks into gear here. Willis predicted that the watershed moment is coming for AI insurance and a creation of a sizable loss. What if you project forward in your head, like what does that look like to you? What does AI do to influence or maybe create that systemic event that we were talking about in more pedestrian terms before?
Yeah, and I think I'll say this, it's probably I'll answer it with a little bit of influence from Eric because of how we view the E&O. This is more of the third party aspect of what AI can represent. I think there's, that loss is getting more and more, there's the cyber claims regarding actual cyber losses and what, was a cyber event. And those can continue to go up, especially with, the biggest vulnerability being human beings still, right? AI is playing a very, very prominent role there now, right? Especially with social engineering. I think that's showing us that, that's already an uptick, right, on the AI side. So I could say that's kind of the easy answer right now. That's in the closest proximity of what we're seeing. But I think it's going to go even further in terms of, the use of agentic AI and services. Hospital systems could be a good example, right, of what that actually could create in terms of an error, an emission, and output, right? Like we have yet to really see that. So if I'm looking at my crystal ball, Chip, and I'm going off street level, and I'm going more kind of, hypothetical and what could be, but I don't think it's really that far from reality, is that the more AI is utilized within services, right, I think we're opening up more and more potential to more of kind of these professional claims, claims, particularly when it comes to, like hospital systems, anything within security, those types of aspects. So Eric, I don't know if you would agree or disagree there, but I think that's where, there's the potential for sure, Chip.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. So that sounds to me like you're not quite there with Willis yet, that there's a pending mega tsunami. It's more like an increase in pace, fanning the flames that are already there before we get to that mega tsunami event.
Yeah, but the speed in which we're moving, Chip, it's like, okay, we're not there yet, but I feel like every week that goes by, it's compounding, right? The speed in which that AI drives new capability is, you can't really comprehend it now. So I say that now, but if we talk in a month, I might have a very different answer.
So shifting gears, Eric talked about ransomware attacks being up 45%. And yet the data showing that payments have dropped 50% year over year because people are just refusing to pay. But the interruption losses associated with that still exceeded $1 billion on live large events. Is that being properly priced into the market, to a soft market in particular?
Probably not fully, to be honest. I think, we got to also take into account, we're looking at different industry classes, but we're also looking at different market sizes, right? So a lot of these stats are, it's easier to drive these or to pull these out of kind of middle market enterprise, right? Versus, where we're still kind of, I think, hungry for more data is that SMB side. And I think most of what we're seeing, we're talking about a soft market, is still on the middle market and below, right? You go middle market and above and more enterprise, where some of these, larger ransomware events are occurring, it is still situational. And I'll give you an example. I'll be talking to an underwriter about certain risks, and depending on the industry, it could be, it's pretty cookie cutter still. Soft market, send it across, blah, blah, blah. Oh, healthcare. What revenue? 250 million? Okay, here's a supplemental, right? I have supplemental questions I now need to get verified. I need to go deeper. And that also is getting rated differently as well, right? So we are seeing situationally things are moving. I don't think that, broadly speaking, it's, enough that, things are not actually priced, generally speaking, correctly yet. I think situationally, they're deciding on pockets they want to lean into and make sure that rating's more accurate.
Hey, Chip.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah. So Chip, Reed, for a while there, we was all about, telemetry. Like there was this movement for cyber insurers to put their telemetry in, Volt scanning and things like that. Well, if we could knock Volt scanning on its head a little bit here with AI and not being able to keep up with the 0 days discovered, is that causing the insurance industry to rethink what that telemetry looks like going forward?
Yes. So it all depends who you're talking to. There's the more insurtech leaning companies that are privy and aware of what they could and should be doing. And there's like the more traditional, think of it more old school. If you talk to a traditionalist, it's kind of like hands in their pockets. Yeah, not really sure what to do. Maybe I'll ask more questions. Right. So there's not really validation. It's just maybe we can scrutinize more. You get to more of the insurtech, forward facing, those that are, I don't think anyone likes insurance scans, but, in terms of what they're trying to do on getting an outside validation at the very least, right? Based on known vulnerabilities. They're trying their best there. But here's the conflict, Andrew. Getting validation has to be scalable. It has to be some streamlined effort. Because I've gone through multiple motions, and we'll probably talk about this later, but I'll give you an example on MSPs. Bringing forth what a really good MSA looks like that an MSP is using, and assuming that's going to have a really good return on investment, so to speak, is still something we're working with insurance carriers on, because MSAs are not a scalable way for them to underwrite. They're not able to look through that. Now, we could talk about tools, ways to do that, but it's not incorporated in the process. So the validation has got to come from either already existing third parties that have that ability. You'll see some of those partnerships in the market, right? Or even downstream partnerships. Like what we're doing with MSPs right now is trying to represent them more as assets than anything, right? An asset that can give visibility downstream. It just has to be, if this is making sense, it has to be scalable, right? They're not embedding it into their own practice.
Yeah, and what I was going to add on there, and Reed, you can talk to this, is it's not like these guys move fast either. There's cycles. If they want to make changes to policies, there's a lengthy process where they go through the language, and then they can't just change policy language and everything overnight. So the industry itself doesn't react incredibly quick either. So you got to take that into account when we're talking about these things. We're talking about things moving super fast, yet we're talking about an industry that traditionally doesn't move that fast.
Yeah. Eric, just one more thing, and I'll hand it back to Chip. Eric, I asked you a little bit about this, but I'm thinking, as a software manufacturer, am I getting asked now about what libraries do I use coming out of this, all these compromises? Am I getting asked for, better indemnification because of that? What are you seeing? Where could this go?
I think the sky's the limit. It's, you used to, I mean, going back a couple of years, you'd see a little paragraph about AI and everything about it. And now you're seeing pages and pages and pages of it. And to your point, you're seeing the integration of AI terms into indemnification clauses, right? Everyone now is asking for indemnification for AI related issues, and trying to narrow that down. What does that mean to be an AI related issue is really difficult.
And I got to believe it's slowing deals down, is it not, Eric? I mean, good for you. I think it's awesome for you from a business perspective, but the velocity of deals, I got to believe it's certainly impacting.
Yeah, any novel concept is going to slow down a deal, right? I don't care what it is, and AI certainly fits into that category.
Yeah, interesting. Chip, back to you. And
my head is spinning. Yeah, as soon as Eric starts talking about AI indemnification, I'm thinking, well, which party is seeking what? And it's probably both, and Reed, that takes us into this. We talked about Mythos earlier in the call. I think we talked about it before when we were just kind of chatting. We've talked about it last week. It demonstrated this ability to jump out of its own containment area. So there's this sort of vision out there that AI is going to be able to break free into the wild and start running rogue on everything. Combine that with the Striker breach, the Intune stuff that happened, MDM and RMM hardening becoming super important, and they'll be even more important next week because there'll be something else popping up. Like, how does all of this get rolled up in a ball of wax? What do you see in terms of how the industry adjusts to MSP premiums in the long run? Is it possible that the MSP market is either priced out or becomes non-underwritable?
Well, it's a really good question. It's the appetite is shrinking quietly, but not collapsing. Okay. So you'll have, when let's reverse maybe 2020 before, right? Probably 12, 15 markets that would say, we'll write MSPs. We'll give them tech E&O. Let's go. Market started to harden. We saw a couple pops that represented systemic risk. And then it was like, oh, okay, you know what? No. And you saw probably that list go down to 5 or 6. Okay. I can say that that list is still probably 5 or 6, and add in a few more that are very quietly having an appetite. Okay. Those that are more focused and emboldened about them, I would actually say, like for MSPs, this is a good stage. There is less fear and more wanting to gain more insight, as I mentioned, kind of view them more as assets. We've been working with specific carriers around leaning into MSPs, especially given the rise of AI, right? That actually can be more ground level when it comes to whatever policies, procedures, and controls can be there. But you can't necessarily attest through an application. And even leaning closer into those MSPs around agentic AI. So like we've worked with a couple carriers now on writing agentic AI endorsements specifically, right? Taking a position, being black or white, it doesn't matter. Take a position, be binary, don't leave it gray. Decide how you're going to cover this, particularly for the MSP, right? Who's also going to be introducing a lot of AI into their services. So, I don't know if that makes sense. It's where it's getting, you could see some of the news and headlines saying we're getting out, we're not going to write MSPs. You're not seeing, which is more of the quiet front, is a couple of them, and I can say this firsthand, are actually leaning in.
Interesting. So, one more question that is just popping in my head out of all of this before, kick this over to Chris. As MSPs are techie geeks at the core, right? So, they're out there playing with agentic AI on their own. Some are probably developing their own agents. Has the industry itself developed a viewpoint on that? Like, is there more of a willingness to underwrite an MSP who's introducing agentic AI into their customer, their own workflow, if it's something you're licensing that's commercially derived? It's the wild, wild west right now, right? Like,
so it's a little bit of the devil, right? Because you've got well, let me answer your question directly and then kind of riff there. The answer is, if we recall, actually, I think I might have been on the cyber call when this was going on. Do you remember, Andrew, when we were talking about there were exclusions around, there were war exclusions, right? And I think I came in and talked about it a little. There was a period of time where there was a very specific exclusion around acts of war. And technically, if the cyber event were to be discovered to be coming from a nation state, as an example, would that be, where does that fall, right? And does that give the carrier the ability to refuse coverage? So we're in a very similar area, gray area, with pretty much 99% of the policies that I see where they're not necessarily excluding it, but they're not necessarily explicitly saying they cover it, right? So that's part of the effort we're going through with some of these markets to say, hey, particularly with MSPs, take a stance. Because if you take the stance right now and you're working with someone that at least can have more ground level understanding of what the heck's going on, especially at the client level, you've got a friend, you've got an ally, you've got an asset right there. But you need to cover them first, right? Especially with the services that they provide.
Wow. Chris.
All right. Let's talk about underwriters. So we know that some of the underwriters, you kind of hinted at this earlier about more the insurtech ones versus maybe the legacy carriers, however you want to categorize them, moving from checkbox questionnaires to verified evidence. What do you see in that today, and where do you see that moving forward as far as carriers asking for more evidence that their controls are in place versus just checking a box once a year?
It depends where we are. Like the SMB market, Chris, I wish I could be saying they're trying to validate more.
No.
It's a little bit scary, actually. Like, I mean, just to be completely candid, I'm talking to underwriters that are, they're trying to find business. So they're saying, yeah, actually, if they don't have certain controls, send them over anyway. We'll do kind of a secondary look.
Yep. Right.
And I'm going, have we learned nothing? Right. So there's that side of the fence. And I hope this isn't all doom and gloom conversation. The ones that I would say are like leaning in probably in the more appropriate places, they understand they don't need to necessarily play the game of the soft market. And I kind of have been alluding to it, but I'll just speak directly. There are 3 or 4 players in this space because of the weight they carry, right? And their confidence and their speed. They're pricing things super low. They keep lowering that bar to entry because they want to get more market share. capacity's high, bring it in. So like that underwriting seems to have like de-evolved, right? It's like gone down. But then there's the players that are trying to sit right in the middle. They know that this is kind of a bell curve we're on. We know it's going to even out, get back to where we need it to be. So they're just staying right in the middle. And they're trying to still ask enough questions. They're incorporating enough, at least external validation, not going crazy internal. But yeah, if I'm being honest, it's not what you would assume given the nature of the rise of events.
Well, yeah, coming from that, I always knew it is a scaling issue too, right? I mean, they're not necessarily equipped to be collecting evidence and maintaining it and all that kind of stuff. So for them to, and for the amount of policies they're writing, that's tough. It's a big ask. It's a big investment if they were to do that. So not really defending them, but just giving some kind of reasons.
The only thing, just to leave it, is I would say they are moving from like let's use MDR as an example. Their understanding of that being like kind of a primary defense to defense containment in terms of kind of like seeing that more it applies on both sides. We're seeing more folks double down on specific controls they know that can kind of decrease the probabilities, right? But where's the validation? Understanding if it's configured properly, those types of things. We're still not seeing it a ton.
Yeah. Next question's around, clauses and policies that deny claims that the protections weren't in place when the attack occurred. Do you see that as being fair? And what do you see going on out there as far as that?
It depends on the policy and who's writing it. I think on a lot of these, like there are phenomenal, from my viewpoint, when I say phenomenal policies, I mean, hey, they're covering soup to nuts what you would hope they're going to cover based off of the nature of the beast as it is today. And you are seeing, I guess you could call it growing clauses, but I would put specific names behind that.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes sense to me. But
I know you would track with that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think there is I know, Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to ask to this question, Eric, has there been any updates in that whole law firm? Because like it seems like, for denials and of things, like that's part of the question, right, Chris? Like, you have an insurance policy and they're not doing what they said they were supposed to do, right? Mm-hmm. Eric, there's this whole lawsuit, right, with the law firm in California. The
Landtech case.
Landtech, is that still underway? Was it ever resolved? And
it's a good question. I haven't looked into it in probably 6 months, but I certainly will.
Okay. Yeah. But you remember that one, Reed? That's where, okay. So like, will we see potentially more of this, or is it, again, it depends. Like, will we see insurers push back on, they really didn't have MFA, or they said they did this, but they really didn't do that.
There's multiple elements in that, Andrew. Like, as crazy as it sounds, there's reputational parts of this too. For a carrier to have a straight up declination of coverage and it, be a headline is not good for them. They don't want that to exist, right? They are trying to sell a product at the end of the day. So they are trying to reserve their capacity and not pay too much out of pocket, which we understand. It's organized gambling. But on the other side of that, double-edged sword is they don't want to have reputational harm that their product isn't doing what they said it should do. You also have, like, behind the scenes, I can name hundreds of times that we've just gone to bat for clients and we've been able to flip the script, if that makes sense. Like, so sometimes it's procedural and they might do something and you're like, well, look, really? And you kind of go to bat. So like, there's a lot of elements that come into play here. I don't think we're going to see it as much right now, because I still think there is a true demand for new business. There's a true demand to get that product out, and they still have this supply they want to fill.
Yeah, and to add on to what Reed said about the reputational side, the soft market makes it a very competitive market, and their competitors will use that against them, guaranteed. So, but it is one thing out there, just to speak to the audience out there, is those are questions that a lot of people don't ask, and they find out the hard way once they file that claim on whether the carrier is one that's more flexible, more understanding versus not so. So, they're not all the same. You touched upon this a little bit earlier about the MSPs potentially being viewed as assets and stuff. And then the third parties out there that are are linking themselves with cyber insurance. We're talking about MSPs potentially being cyber insurance readiness partners, and also first responders, I guess, maybe from a business resumption or even that more so. What would be your advice to MSPs that are wanting to potentially, investigate this further to see how they can play a part in that?
Definitely investigate it. Let's start there. Look into it, because it requires it. I think one of the main learnings that we've had over the years working with MSPs is what we're talking about is it's an operational change, right? So you kind of have to have some organization to this new operations of incorporating this conversation and getting involved at this level. So on that aspect, absolutely look into it to see as in what you're able to represent to a carrier is a lot. But there's reciprocation there to a degree. There's involvement. So there's multiple programs out there right now. Okay. As a broker, I can speak, positively to most of them to say they're trying to incorporate more understanding at the ground level of what an MSP is doing, to have that translate of why that's beneficial to a carrier, right? And the ROI should flow downhill, right? That's a lot of value and validation for that MSP to be seen by their client. It's just one other layer of someone saying, look, you're doing things correctly by today's standards, or at least we're gonna acknowledge that you're a better risk.
Reed, just maybe a tangent on this.
Yeah.
Are the insurance companies savvy enough to, I'll pick out like a Summit 7 who, has gone to the extreme of their internal security program because of the fact that they service federal and, to the highest order.
Absolutely.
Around, like, does the insurance company go, wow, that's probably a really good risk for us to insure a company like that with that kind of scrutiny, that kind of security program, CMMC level 2, ISO, you name it, they've done it and continue to elevate because of who they're getting ready for their CMMC level 2 assessments, or 3 even in that case.
The answer is yes, Andrew. And it's these crossroads. We were kind of joking about it before the call, right? Of compliance, right? Finally, having an industry like insurance, who I think we're all probably going to say this, should have been looking at already existing compliance levers they could have been leaning on, right? For validation, there's already this existing motions. I'm seeing it more and more. I wish I was seeing a lot more sooner. But sometimes it's a great example. What's happening right now is you still need some type of catalyst into this industry, it seems, to grab the attention of the right person up top and say, look at this, right? So there still seems to be a requirement of a third party getting involved to create kind of a organization of the operational aspect of how this would work from an underwriting, because they're so used to their box. They have their box. We're saying there's all these other boxes that exist. Can you just copy and paste to a degree? So the answer is yes, Andrew. There's still facilitation. Like, that's what we do a lot of, so I can speak to it. But they're not being as proactive as you would think to seek those out on their own.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and the facilitation is the key word there. I mean, that's where your broker goes to bat for you and explains that to the underwriter, and then they'll take that to an account. Yeah. So if you just fill out an application and send that sucker in, think they're going to pick up on that on their own, no, that's not going to happen. But having somebody that understands your business, that's representing you, which is the whole point of a broker, will make that. And then, kind of a second part where you and maybe Eric can kind of fit is what additional liability, if an MSP gets into that business, what additional liability could the MSP take on if they start to do these things that we talked about with insurance carriers?
None at all, right, Eric? No liability at all. In fact, just
nothing.
Just
right. Don't even mention it. Absolutely.
I just want to see your face.
They can just launch a bunch of AI tools and get it done.
Yeah, exactly. But in reality, going, Andrew, back to your question about the sophistication of the insurance companies and are they picking up on these things? I don't see it yet, right? Because I see a lot of applications for both tech E&O and for cyber, and the questions are horrible. And I say that a little bit tongue in cheek, right? But I have more questions on their questions than answers to their questions. just based on how they're posed. And I don't think that they are as sophisticated as they could be. And to Chris's point, that's why you need a really, really good agent, a really good broker who can go to bat for you, and talk through these things with the underwriters, because the applications alone are not at all going to get you there.
Yeah. Yeah. And you've given a very good example in the past, right, Eric? Like, do you have MFA, right? On what? On what resources?
Or do you have a limitation of liability clause in your contract, right, with your customers? There's 87 different ways to write a limitation of liability clause. Yeah, we limit our liability to $1 billion. So yes, we have a limitation of liability clause, but that's not what the insurer is getting at, but they don't ask those questions.
So Eric doesn't know this yet, but in about 2 weeks, he's going to be on with the chief underwriting officer for one of the largest writers of cyber insurance in North America. Wait for the invitation, Eric. But literally,
maybe we're egged at this point, though, Reed.
It is an educational conversation to help inform them about this third-party liability and the weight of, like, what does a properly written MSA actually do here?
Yeah.
Right. And you'd be surprised with the limited understanding and knowledge of how that actually applies or should be applied in their underwriting process. But we're just trying.
And it's not hard. It really isn't hard for an insurer to write really, really good questions and qualifying questions and everything else. They just don't do it. And Teresa's point, I think it's just because they don't understand it.
Hey, I know we're getting towards the end here. I want to ask Chip something on the software side. Chip, I'll harken back to Ryan Weeks probably 5-6 years ago when SolarWinds occurred, and he didn't get one question from an MSP during that whole thing. Was Datto running, it's before the merger, right? He's the CISO of Datto. He didn't get one question from an MSP. Do you guys run SolarWinds? My question is, are you getting more questions from MSPs about the tools you're using, the open source stuff you're using, or are MSPs getting better at scrutinizing who they're using?
I would say in general, no. I mean, it's funny that you asked this because, since transitioning into this role as VP of compliance for Kaseya in general, way more than just looking at SaaS alerts, I certainly see a lot more requests come across the transom, and occasionally some of them are asking for very, very detailed information, so much so that we can't share it in terms of, hey, well, we're going to send you, this document. We'll show people almost anything. But, when you have internal documentation, that's not something you send somebody in a file. You don't send them your software bill of materials so that they can go through it. Like, that in and of itself goes against every caution you would have as a software developer. You don't send somebody your incident response plan, cover to cover, all 700 pages of it or whatever it is, 60 pages of it. You don't do those things. And I do see some of those kinds of requests coming across. I think Eric or somebody mentioned earlier, about, what open source libraries do you use? Or like, never in a million years would you expose that information. That's certainly, you could talk about it with an informed partner in a conversation, in a secure Teams meeting or something like that. But you could never hand somebody documentation of that, because you're just potentially handing it to your adversaries. It gets out in the wild, and now you've got a big problem on your hands. So the answer,
Chip, when you say you're seeing more of it, is it now 1.5% of Kaseya's customers are asking the questions instead of 0.5%?
Yeah. Or ask me about this time next year, then I'll be able to give you a much better idea. In terms of the number of Kaseya's customers, it's not even 1%. It's probably less than 0.1%. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny number. And I don't know if that's occurred in previous years because I just didn't sit in this seat. I know we had this happen a few times in the SaaS alerts days. And I was, I dug my heels in really solidly. I'm like, there's just no way we're sharing that kind of information with you. The reason we carry an ISO and SOC 2s and other is because it's the auditor's job to dig into this stuff and make sure that that our practices are correct. We're happy to show you, the auditor's report, or in the case of an ISO, we're happy to show you the certificate, SOC 2, the auditor summary management response. But even those documents in whole contain a lot of information that an adversary can use against you. You can't hand them out into the wild, not knowing where they're going to wind up. So, Andrew, I think the core of your question was, as a software company and as somebody who's, produced multiple different business applications aimed at the MSP market, are MSPs asking us about our software development practices? And I think the overall answer is no. I think this is true of everyone, myself included. We have a tendency to trust commercial off-the-shelf software that has a large market penetration, has all the right certifications. We as human beings don't generally have a critical eye towards that. I can tell you that Kaseya as a company has a very, very rigorous third-party vendor vetting process, including for software applications. We actually do a full-scale security review. We won't do business with anybody without it. But that is not the typical practice that I see, among SMBs and the people who represent SMBs.
Yeah, well said. All right, Reed, awesome having you on. It's been a while. I said this at the beginning. Next week we'll have on Rich Mogul, Sunil Yu, John Strand, and we will get into the Mythos Ready security document that CSA and SANS and others, 80 some odd CISOs wrote and collaborated on in a matter of 48 hours. I think it's going to be really, really interesting to listen to how they did it, what we can take away from it. So with that, Chip, thanks as always for filling in, Eric and Chris as well. Everybody out there, be safe, and we'll look forward to seeing you next Monday. Take care, everyone.
If you're in the Write a Boom community but not in our Discord yet, you're missing where the real conversation happens. Join community.writeaboom.com to access cybercall discussions, upcoming CTFs, boom camps, and early access to what's coming next. If you want to stay close to what's actually happening in the MSP security space, I'll see you there.